So how do we traverse arrays in Java? Well, on this left-hand side, we have an example here with the integer array vals, and it's storing 3 values. And remember that this array currently has the values all zeros, because the default value of the integer data type in Java is 0. Now let's say we're given the task of setting the ith element in an array to I and printing that out. So what does this mean, setting the ith element in an array to I? Well, that means that we'd set the 0th element and we'd set the val 0 to 0. We'd set the first element, meaning we'd get val 1, and we'd set that to 1, and so on. So we set the corresponding index in this array equal to the specific value of I, the index that we're setting. So we can use a for loop for this. You might have figured out. So we start with a standard for loop declaration here. We have the 3 parts. We're setting I to 0, since we want to start at the 0th index, since that's where arrays start at, just like strings do. And we have the second condition, where we're setting, we're constraining I to be less than vals.length, and vals.length is 3. So I will always be less than 3. So the loop will go through the values when I is 0, 1, and 2. And then we are incrementing I each time by 1, right? So 0, 1, 2. Now let's look at what's happening inside the for loop. The first statement, we're setting vals, the ith element of vals, to I, which is what we discussed before. So val 0 would be equal to 0, vals 1 would be equal to 1, and so on. And then we're printing out the the element that we just changed. Okay, so what would this look like? What would be printed out to the console? Let's say our console's right here. What would be printed out? So to start with, I is 0, and we made that table earlier. Let me remake it. And it goes through these 3 values. So when val 0 is set to 0, what's going to be printed out to the console? 0. When vals 1 is set to 1, 1 is going to be printed out to the console. And when vals 2 is set to 2, the last element in the array, it's going to print out 2 to the console. So that's how we can set the ith element in the array vals to I, and then printing out that specific element. On the right hand side, we have a little more complicated example, but we have the string array names, and we have these 4 names inside that array: John, Mary, Robert, and Olivia. It's the same array from the last video, but we are tasked with finding a method to find the position of a target name in this array. So the target name is an argument that's passed into this find pause method, and we can see that find pause is actually being called down here, and we're feeding in the name Robert. And what we're tasked to do is we're trying to find Robert's position, if it exists at all, in this target array names. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we have a string n, right? We're making a placeholder string, and this placeholder string, we're going to use it later on. But first, let's look at the next line. In the next line, we have a for loop. And this for loop is identical to the last one. We're going to be incrementing through each element in the names array. The first line of the for loop is where we assign this previously discussed string n to, we assign it the value of names, of the ith element of names. So when I is 0 to begin with, we're assigning names 0. What is that? That's John. So n would be John to begin with. Now we say if the string n dot equals target name, which is the argument we're passing in, return the current index you're on, which is the value of I. So remember, this is how we compare 2 strings with the dot equals method. But right now, we discussed earlier, n is John, and target name we passed in down here as Robert. So John does not equal Robert. So we're not going to enter this conditional and return I. Instead, we're going to continue with the for loop. Let's keep going. We go on to Mary, because I is now going to be equal to 1. since we incremented it. And when we set the string n, we replace its value now with Mary. And Mary dot equals, we have target name Robert. That's of course not true. The string Mary is not identical to the string Robert. So we, again, go over this conditional, do not enter it, and instead go to the next iteration of this for loop, where now n is being set to Robert, and then target name is, of course, Robert. Now these two strings are identical, so we are going to return I. I currently is 2. Therefore, when we system.out.println, right down here, find pause, it's going to print 2. That is the position of the string Robert inside the names array. Pretty handy little method we have going on. But let's say we entered in Rob instead of Robert. Now, since there isn't any Rob string inside of the names array, there's only John, Manny, Robert, and Olivia, what's going to happen is it's going to go through this for loop, total of 4 times, right? And it's not going to basically come to this return statement. Instead, it's going to keep going, but we still have to return, as you'll see, an integer, because find pause has a return type int. Since we have to return an integer, we're going to return -1 to signify the fact that this, basically this string Rob was never found in our array.